The autumn wind carried the scent of smoke and fear across the Dakota territory. Sarah, running bare, pressed herself against the rough bark of an old cottonwood tree, her dark eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. At 17, she had learned to read the land like her grandmother read the sacred stories. But today, the familiar rolling hills held only danger. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart race. She had been running for 2 days now, surviving on wild berries and stream water, her deerskin dress torn from thorns, and her long black braids tangled with burrs. The bandits had come to her village like wolves in the night, burning tippis and driving away the horses. Her father and the other warriors had fought bravely, but there were too many of the white men with their guns and their thirst for gold. As the hoofbeats grew closer, Sarah spotted a small ranch house in the distance, smoke rising peacefully from its chimney. Desperation overcame caution. She had nowhere else to go, no other choice but to trust in the kindness of strangers. Her moccasined feet moved silently across the dry grass as she approached the modest wooden structure. The ranch belonged to Thomas Mackenzie, a weathered man in his 50s who had come west after losing his family to cholera in Missouri. He had built this place with his own hands, raising cattle and horses, while trying to forget the pain of his past. Thomas was mending a bridle on his front porch when he saw the young Lakota woman emerge from the tree line. She moved like a frightened deer, ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. Her clothes marked her as one of the local tribes, and Thomas could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way she favored her left foot, as if it pained her. When she drew close enough to speak, her voice was barely above a whisper, carried on the wind like a prayer. "Please, may I remain until the bandits disappear?" she asked, her English careful and measured, learned from the missionary school she had attended as a child, before returning to her people's ways. Thomas said nothing at first, studying her face. He had heard the distant gunshots 2 nights ago, seen the orange glow on the northern horizon that spoke of burning buildings. The frontier was a dangerous place, filled with men who took what they wanted without thought for those they hurt. He knew the look of someone running for their life. Without a word, he nodded toward his front door. Sarah's shoulders sagged with relief so profound that she nearly collapsed. Thomas rose from his chair and gestured for her to follow him inside, noting how she kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting pursuit at any moment. The interior of the ranch house was simple but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rough wooden table and 2 chairs in the center of the room. Sarah hesitated at the threshold, unused to white man's dwellings but desperate enough to enter. Thomas poured water from a pitcher into a basin and offered it to her without ceremony. As Sarah washed the dust and fear from her face, Thomas studied her more carefully. She was beautiful in the way of her people, with high cheekbones and skin bronzed by the prairie sun. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, dark and intelligent, holding depths of knowledge about survival that most white women her age could never imagine. "The Garner Gang," Thomas said simply, more statement than question. Sarah nodded, recognizing the name of the notorious group of outlaws who had been terrorizing the territory for months. Led by Jake Garner, a former Confederate soldier turned bandit, they specialized in raiding isolated settlements and Indian villages, stealing whatever they could carry, and burning the rest. "They came at dawn," Sarah said, her voice stronger now that she felt relatively safe. "My father sent me away when he saw how many there were. I have been walking since then, hiding during the day, moving at night. I saw their tracks heading south this morning." Thomas nodded grimly. The Garner Gang was known for their persistence. If they thought there was more to be gained from Sarah's village, they might return, and if they had seen her escape, they might follow her trail. A young Lakota woman would bring a good price from certain unsavory traders who dealt in human misery. "You can stay," Thomas said, making a decision that would change both their lives. "But we need to be careful. If they're tracking you, this place won't stay safe for long." Sarah's gratitude was evident in her expression, but she was too proud to weep. Instead, she offered what she could in return. "I can work. I know horses and cattle. I can cook and mend. I will not be a burden." Thomas almost smiled at that. In his experience, Indian women were often better at frontier survival than most white men. "There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen floor," he said. "If riders come, you hide there until I give the all clear." "Can you shoot?" Sarah nodded. Her father had taught her to use both bow and rifle, though she preferred the silence of her traditional weapons. Thomas disappeared into his bedroom and returned with an old Colt revolver and a box of ammunition. "Keep this with you," he said, "and pray you never have to use it." The first day passed quietly. Sarah proved to be exactly what she had promised, working alongside Thomas to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a recent storm. Her knowledge of horses impressed him when she calmed a skittish mare that had been giving him trouble for weeks. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime spent in harmony with animals and the natural world. As evening approached, they worked together to prepare a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Sarah added wild herbs she had gathered during their fence work, flavoring the food in a way that reminded Thomas of meals his wife used to make. The comparison should have been painful, but instead, it felt like a gentle memory rather than a sharp wound. They ate in comfortable silence as the sun set over the prairie. Sarah seemed less frightened now, though Thomas noticed how her eyes still moved constantly to the windows and her hand never strayed far from the pistol he had given her. Trust, he knew, would take time to build fully. "Tell me about your family," Thomas said as they finished eating. It was the first personal question he had asked, and Sarah considered it carefully before answering. "My father is Chief Walking Elk. Our band follows the old ways but tries to live in peace with the white settlements. We trade horses and buffalo hides for tools and cloth. My mother died when I was young, so my grandmother raised me. She taught me the stories of our people and the ways of healing." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of such traditions. "My wife knew herbs," he said quietly. "She could cure most anything that ailed man or beast. Lost her to the cholera before we could make it out here together. The shared loss created a bridge between them, an understanding that transcended the differences in their backgrounds. Both had known love and loss, hope and disappointment. Both had found themselves alone on an unforgiving frontier, where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. As night fell, Thomas showed Sarah to a small room that had been intended as a nursery. There was a single bed with a patchwork quilt and a window that faced east toward the rising sun. Sarah tested the firmness of the mattress and nodded her approval. She was accustomed to sleeping on the ground, so any bed was a luxury. "I'll take the first watch," Thomas said. "You need rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out our next move." Sarah wanted to protest that she could stand guard as well as any man, but exhaustion was finally catching up with her. The adrenaline that had kept her moving for 2 days was fading, leaving her drained and shaky. She curled up on the bed, fully clothed, the revolver within easy reach, and listened to Thomas's boots on the wooden floor as he made his rounds. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. Somewhere out there, the Garner gang was probably making camp, planning their next raid. Sarah wondered about her father and the others who had remained to fight. Had they survived? Had the village been completely destroyed? The questions tormented her as she drifted between wakefulness and uneasy sleep. Thomas spent the night checking the perimeter of his property, his own rifle never far from his hands. He had dealt with outlaws before, but the Garner gang was different. They were organized, ruthless, and completely without conscience. If they came here looking for Sarah, there would be no negotiating, no reasoning with them. As dawn approached, Thomas allowed himself to hope that perhaps the bandits had moved on to easier targets. But even as the thought formed in his mind, he caught sight of dust on the horizon, moving steadily toward his ranch. His blood turned cold as he counted the riders. 6 men, riding hard and with purpose. The Garner gang had found them. Thomas burst through the front door of his ranch house, his weathered face grim with urgency. "Sarah! They're coming!" he called out, grabbing his rifle from above the fireplace. The young Lakota woman appeared instantly from the kitchen, her dark eyes alert and focused despite having been awakened from the first deep sleep she'd had in days. Without hesitation, Sarah dropped to her knees beside the kitchen table and pulled up the loose floorboards that revealed the entrance to the root cellar. The space below was cramped and dark, barely large enough for one person, but it would have to do. Thomas handed her a candle and matches, along with extra ammunition for the revolver. "No matter what you hear up here, don't come out until I give you the signal," Thomas said firmly. 3 knocks, then 2, then 3 again. "Remember that pattern." Sarah nodded and squeezed into the narrow space, pulling the boards back into place above her head, just as the thunder of approaching hoofbeats reached the ranch. Thomas scattered a thin layer of dirt over the floorboards and kicked a rag rug over the area, then positioned himself at the front window with his rifle ready. The Garner gang rode into his yard like a storm cloud, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces hard with the cruel confidence of men who took what they wanted. Jake Garner himself led them, a tall man with pale blue eyes and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. His followers were a mixed group of deserters, drifters, and career criminals, united only by their greed and their willingness to use violence. "Morning, farmer," Garner called out, not bothering to dismount. "Nice little spread you got here. Peaceful, quiet. The kind of place a man might come to hide something valuable." Thomas stepped out onto his porch, keeping his rifle visible but not directly threatening. "I'm just a simple rancher," he said evenly. "Don't have much worth stealing, if that's what you're after." Garner laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh. We're not here for your cattle or your few sorry horses. We're tracking something much more interesting. An Indian girl, young and pretty. She ran from her village when we visited there a few nights back. Tracks lead right to your door." "Haven't seen any Indian girl," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "You boys are welcome to water your horses and move on, but there's nothing here for you." The outlaw leader's eyes narrowed as he studied Thomas's face for signs of deception. "That's funny, old man. Because my tracker Squint here is pretty good at following sign, and he says that girl definitely came this way." He gestured to a thin man with a patchy beard who was already dismounting to examine the ground around the ranch house. Squint moved like a hunting dog, nose practically to the ground as he followed Sarah's trail from the tree line to the front porch. Thomas forced himself to remain calm as the tracker's examination grew more thorough. The man was clearly skilled at his unsavory profession. "Boss," Squint called out, pointing to a spot near the front steps. "She was here. All right. Footprint in the mud by the water trough. Small moccasin. Probably made by the Northern Plains tribes. And look here." He knelt by the porch railing, scraping something from the wood with his fingernail. Bit of buckskin thread, caught on a splinter. She definitely made it this far. Thomas's mind raced as he tried to think of a plausible explanation. "Well, now that you mention it, there was a young woman came by yesterday morning. Said she was headed south to her relatives. I gave her some water and sent her on her way. She's probably 20 miles from here by now." Garner's smile was cold and predatory. "Is that so? And which direction did this helpful young lady travel?" "South by southwest," Thomas said without hesitation. "Toward the reservation lands. Said she had family there who would take her in." The outlaw leader considered this for a long moment, then nodded to 2 of his men. "Cooper, Briggs, go search the house. If she's hiding in there, drag her out. If not, we'll know our friend here is telling the truth about her moving on." Thomas's blood turned to ice, but he forced himself to remain outwardly calm. "Now see here. I don't appreciate strangers going through my personal belongings. I've told you the truth about the girl. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't," Garner said, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "But we've come a long way to collect our property, and we're not leaving empty-handed. The way I see it, you can cooperate and maybe live to tend your cattle another day. Or you can make this difficult and end up feeding the crows." Cooper and Briggs dismounted and pushed past Thomas into the ranch house. Thomas could hear them overturning furniture, kicking open doors, and generally destroying everything he had worked to build. Below the kitchen floor, Sarah crouched in darkness, the revolver heavy in her hands, as she listened to the sounds of search and destruction above her head. The 2 outlaws were thorough but not particularly intelligent. They checked the bedroom, the main room, and even climbed into the small attic space. But they never thought to examine the kitchen floor carefully. The scattered dirt and strategically placed rug fooled them completely, just as Thomas had hoped. After 20 minutes of fruitless searching, Cooper and Briggs emerged from the house, shaking their heads. "Nothing, boss," Cooper reported. "No sign of any Indian girl. Just an old man's belongings and not much worth taking." Garner's expression darkened with frustration. He had been certain the girl would be here, and the idea that she might have slipped through his fingers was infuriating. "Squint. Check the barn. The outbuildings. Anywhere she might be hiding. Look for fresh sign, any indication she's been here recently." The tracker nodded and began a systematic examination of every structure on the property. Thomas watched with growing anxiety as Squint examined the barn, the tool shed, and even the outhouse. The man was persistent and methodical, clearly experienced at hunting human prey. Meanwhile, Jake Garner had not given up on interrogating Thomas. "You know, old man, I've been thinking about your story. It's a little too neat, a little too convenient. A frightened Indian girl shows up at your door, and you just happen to help her on her way without asking any questions? Without wondering why she might be running?" Thomas met the outlaw's gaze steadily. "I mind my own business out here. Always have. A person wants to travel through my land. I don't ask their life story. I offer water and directions if they need them, and I send them on their way. That's how decent folks behave." "Decent folks," Garner repeated mockingly. "That's rich, coming from a man who's probably been trading with the savages, maybe even taking one to his bed. I've heard tell of white men who develop unnatural attachments to Indian women, makes them do foolish things." The accusation was designed to provoke Thomas into an angry response that might reveal something useful. Instead, Thomas simply shrugged. "Think what you want." The girl came and went. That's all there is to it. Squint returned from his examination of the outbuildings, his face grim with disappointment. "No fresh sign anywhere, boss. If she was here, she didn't linger. Could be the old man's telling the truth about her moving on." Garner cursed under his breath. The girl represented a significant potential profit, and losing her trail was a serious setback. But he was also a pragmatist who knew when to cut his losses. "All right, boys, mount up. We'll head south and see if we can pick up her trail. But first..." He turned back to Thomas with malice glittering in his pale eyes. "I think our friend here needs a reminder about the consequences of lying to Jake Garner." Before Thomas could react, Briggs had stepped up behind him and clubbed him across the back of the head with the butt of his pistol. Thomas dropped to his knees, stars exploding across his vision as blood trickled down his neck. The blow was calculated to hurt and intimidate without causing permanent damage. "That's for making us waste our time," Garner said conversationally. "Next time we meet, you better hope you're more forthcoming with information. Come on, boys. We've got tracking to do." The 6 outlaws mounted their horses and rode south, leaving a cloud of dust hanging over the ranch. Thomas remained on his hands and knees for several minutes, waiting for the dizziness to pass and making sure they were truly gone. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did he struggle to his feet and make his way into the house. Following the agreed-upon signal, Thomas knocked 3 times on the kitchen floor, then twice, then 3 times again. The floorboards lifted immediately, and Sarah's worried face appeared in the opening. She took one look at the blood matting Thomas's hair and scrambled out of the hiding place, her healer's instincts taking over. "Sit down," she commanded, guiding him to a chair. "Let me see how badly you're hurt." Her gentle fingers probed the wound on his scalp, determining that while it was bloody and painful, it wasn't serious. She fetched clean water and cloth, cleaning the cut with practiced efficiency. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly as she worked. "You could have given me up to them. Many white men would have. To save themselves trouble." Thomas winced as she dabbed at the cut. "I gave you my word that you'd be safe here. I don't go back on my word, especially not to help scum like the Garner gang." Sarah finished cleaning the wound and bound it with a strip of clean cloth. "They will be back," she said with certainty. "Men like that don't give up easily, and they will be angry that they found nothing here." "Aparted on manor. Aparted on manor. Aparted on manor on manor on manor," Thomas nodded grimly. Then we need to be ready for them. This place isn't safe anymore. Not for either of us. We need to think about moving on. At least temporarily. Where would we go? Sarah asked. The nearest town is 3 days' ride, and they might be watching the roads. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, thinking. There's an old trapper's cabin about 10 miles north, up in the foothills. Fellow named Dutch Henley used to live there, but he died last winter. It's rough country, hard to find unless you know exactly where to look. We could hole up there until the gang moves on to easier pickings. Sarah considered this plan. It would mean abandoning your ranch, your cattle, everything you've built here. Property can be replaced, Thomas said firmly. Lives can't. Besides, if we stay here, we're sitting ducks. At least in the mountains we'd have the high ground and plenty of places to hide. The decision made, they spent the rest of the day preparing for their departure. Thomas gathered essential supplies, while Sarah helped him cache anything valuable that couldn't be easily transported. They would travel light and fast, taking only what they needed to survive in the wilderness. As evening approached, Thomas loaded a pack horse with their supplies while Sarah saddled her own mount, a gentle mare named Star that Thomas had offered for her use. The plan was to leave before dawn, using the cover of darkness to mask their departure and confuse any attempts to track them. That night, as they took turns standing watch, Sarah found herself studying Thomas in the firelight. He was a good man, she realized. Someone who stood by his principles even when it cost him dearly. In her experience, such men were rare among any people, white or Lakota. "Why are you helping me?" she asked during her watch, when Thomas was supposed to be resting. "Really, you barely know me, and already it has brought you nothing but trouble." Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might have fallen asleep. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife and I, we tried for years to have children. She lost 3 babies before they drew their first breath. Always blamed myself, wondered if there was something I could have done different." He paused, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "When I saw you standing there, asking for help, it reminded me of how vulnerable life can be. How we're all just trying to survive in a world that doesn't much care whether we live or die." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. "I'm sorry for your losses," she said softly. "But you cannot blame yourself for things beyond your control." "Maybe not," Thomas said, "but I can control whether I help someone who needs it, and maybe that's enough." They rode out before dawn, leaving the ranch in darkness with their supplies and their hopes for survival. Behind them, the house stood empty and vulnerable, a reminder of the life Thomas was sacrificing to protect a young woman he barely knew. Neither of them saw the lone rider watching from a distant hilltop, or the smile that crossed Jake Garner's scarred face as he turned his horse to follow their trail. The morning sun painted the rocky foothills in shades of gold and crimson as Thomas and Sarah guided their horses up the narrow, mountain trail. They had been riding for 3 hours since leaving the ranch, following an ancient deer path that wound through stands of pine and aspen toward Dutch Henley's abandoned cabin. The air grew thinner and cooler with each mile of elevation they gained, and their horses' breath began to form small clouds in the crisp mountain air. Sarah rode with the natural grace of someone born to the saddle, her body moving in perfect harmony with her mount despite the treacherous terrain. Thomas couldn't help but admire her skill as she guided Star around loose rocks and fallen logs with barely a glance at the obstacles. Her Lakota upbringing had taught her to read the land like a book, to see dangers and opportunities that most white settlers would miss entirely. "The cabin should be just ahead," Thomas said, pointing to a cluster of pine trees that seemed to grow in an unnatural pattern. "Dutch built it in a clearing that's hidden from below, but has a good view of all the approaches. Smart man, for a hermit." As they rounded a bend in the trail, the cabin came into view exactly as Thomas had described. It was a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney and a small lean-to stable that had clearly been built by someone who understood mountain living. The clearing around it was overgrown with wildflowers and tall grass, showing that no one had lived there for months. But the building itself appeared to be in good condition. Thomas dismounted and approached the cabin cautiously, his rifle ready, despite the apparent abandonment of the place. Outlaws and desperate men sometimes use such isolated locations as hideouts, and he had no desire to walk into an ambush. Sarah followed his example, keeping watch on their back trail while Thomas checked the interior of the cabin. The single room was dusty but intact, with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and a sleeping alcove built into one corner. Dried herbs still hung from the rafters, filling the air with the scent of sage and mountain mint. A few basic supplies remained on shelves carved into the log walls, and Thomas was relieved to find that Dutch's rifle and ammunition were gone, suggesting that someone had properly claimed the old trapper's belongings, rather than leaving them to rot. "It will do," Thomas said, emerging from the cabin. "We can make it comfortable enough for a few days while we figure out our next move. Help me get the horses settled, then we'll see about making this place livable." They spent the rest of the morning arranging their temporary home. Sarah proved invaluable in this task, her knowledge of wilderness survival complementing Thomas's more conventional frontier skills. She showed him which of the dried herbs were still good for cooking and medicine, while he repaired a broken shutter and cleaned out the fireplace. By afternoon, they had transformed the abandoned cabin into a cozy refuge. A cheerful fire crackled in the fireplace, driving away the mountain chill, and the aroma of Sarah's herb-seasoned stew filled the small space with warmth and comfort. For the first time since her village had been attacked, Sarah felt something approaching peace. "This reminds me of my grandmother's lodge," she said softly, stirring the stew with a wooden spoon they had found among Dutch's belongings. "She always said that home is not a place, but a feeling of safety." I had forgotten what that felt like. Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The ranch that had been his home for 5 years now felt like a lifetime ago, replaced by this small cabin and the surprising companionship of a young woman from a culture he barely understood. Yet somehow, it felt right in a way he couldn't quite explain. Their peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the distant sound of horses moving through the forest below. Both Thomas and Sarah froze, listening intently as the sounds grew closer. Through the cabin's single window, they could see movement in the trees, the flash of sunlight on metal that meant armed men. "How did they find us so quickly?" Sarah whispered, moving away from the window. Thomas cursed under his breath. "Garner must have left someone watching the ranch. Or maybe they picked up our trail when we thought we were clear." He checked his rifle and made sure the extra ammunition was within easy reach. "Either way, we're about to have company." The cabin's location worked in their favor, positioned as it was on high ground with thick forest on 3 sides and a steep cliff at the back. Any attack would have to come uphill through the trees, giving the defenders both cover and the advantage of elevation. But Thomas knew that advantages meant little when facing 6 armed men with nothing to lose. Jake Garner's voice echoed through the forest as the outlaws approached. "Come on out, old man. We know you're up there with our property. Make this easy on yourself and send the girl down to us. We'll let you live to tend your cattle another day." "Property," Sarah spat, her dark eyes flashing with anger. "That is what they think of my people. Of all women. Things to be owned and traded like horses or cattle." Thomas positioned himself at the window, rifle ready. "Not while I'm breathing," he said grimly. "No one owns you, Sarah. No one has the right to take you against your will." Garner tried negotiation one more time. "I'm a reasonable man, farmer. The girl is worth good money to us. But I'm willing to share the profit. Send her down and we'll split the take 50-50. You could buy yourself a nice spread in California with that kind of cash." "Go to hell," Thomas shouted back. And the talking phase of the confrontation came to an abrupt end. The first shots rang out almost immediately, muzzle flashes winking like deadly fireflies in the shadows of the pines. Thomas returned fire, aiming carefully at shapes moving through the underbrush. Sarah crouched beside the fireplace, pistol ready, watching the cabin's single door for any attempt at a frontal assault. The battle was fierce but brief. The outlaws had expected easy prey, not a prepared defense from high ground. 2 of Garner's men went down in the first exchange of gunfire, and a third was wounded in the shoulder when he tried to circle around to the cabin's blind side. The remaining bandits quickly discovered that rushing uphill through thick forest toward an entrenched position was a losing proposition. After 20 minutes of sporadic shooting, an ominous silence settled over the mountainside. Thomas kept his rifle trained on the tree line, knowing that Garner was too cunning to give up so easily. The outlaw leader had built his reputation on persistence and ruthless determination, qualities that had kept him alive and profitable in a dangerous profession. "They're planning something," Sarah said quietly, her warrior's instincts telling her that the quiet was deceptive. "This is not over." Her intuition proved correct when the smell of smoke began drifting through the cabin's chinks and cracks. Garner had ordered his remaining men to set fire to the forest, hoping to drive Thomas and Sarah out of their stronghold. It was a desperate tactic that could easily get out of control in the dry mountain timber. But desperate men often resorted to desperate measures. "The whole mountainside could go up," Thomas said, watching orange flames begin to flicker through the trees below them. "We can't stay here much longer." Sarah was already moving, gathering their essential supplies into packs that could be carried easily. There, she said, pointing toward the cliff face behind the cabin. "I saw a ledge when we arrived, running along the rock face toward the north. It's narrow, but we might be able to follow it far enough to get clear of the fire and find another way down." Thomas looked where she was pointing and felt his stomach drop. The ledge she mentioned was barely 3 feet wide, running along the sheer cliff face, about 20 feet below the cabin. One slip would mean a fall of several hundred feet onto jagged rocks, but as the smoke grew thicker and the flames crept closer, it began to look like their only option for escape. They gathered what they could carry and led their horses out of the lean-to stable. The animals were already nervous from the smell of smoke, but Sarah spoke to them in her native tongue, her voice calm and soothing despite their desperate circumstances. Following her lead, the horses allowed themselves to be guided down the steep path to the ledge. The journey along the cliff face was a nightmare of concentration and terror. Thomas had never been comfortable with heights, and looking down into the rocky abyss made his head swim with vertigo. Sarah, however, moved along the narrow ledge with the sure-footed confidence of someone raised in mountain country, leading Star, while her own mount followed docilely behind. Behind them, the cabin erupted in flames as the forest fire reached the clearing. The old logs burned fiercely, sending a column of black smoke high into the clear mountain air. From their precarious position on the ledge, Thomas and Sarah could hear Garner and his remaining men cursing as they realized their quarry had escaped the trap. "There, on the cliff face," Squint's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "They're trying to get away along that ledge." Rifle shots echoed off the rock walls as the outlaws tried to pick off the fugitives from their position in the burning forest. But the distance was too great, and the angle too acute for accurate shooting. The bullets sparked off stone or whistled harmlessly past, serving mainly to terrify the horses and make an already dangerous journey even more harrowing. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the ledge widened into a natural shelf of rock that offered both safety and concealment. Thomas collapsed against the cliff wall, his legs shaking from the combination of fear and physical exertion. Sarah remained standing, studying the terrain ahead with the calculating gaze of someone planning their next move. "We can follow this shelf to the north for about a mile," she said, pointing along the rock face. "Then there's a game trail that leads down through a canyon. If we move quickly, we can be in the valley before they find another way around the fire." Thomas nodded, though privately he wondered if he had the strength for another mile of cliff face hiking. The stress of the gunfight and the terror of the ledge had drained him more than he cared to admit, but Sarah's calm competence gave him confidence, and he forced himself to his feet. They continued their perilous journey, moving as quickly as caution would allow. Behind them, the forest fire spread through the dry timber with frightening speed, creating its own weather system of wind and heat that sent embers dancing through the air like deadly snowflakes. The sight was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a reminder of nature's power to both create and destroy. The game trail Sarah had spotted proved to be a narrow defile carved into the mountainside by centuries of runoff from spring snowmelt. It was steep and rocky, but it offered cover from observation and a relatively safe path down to the valley floor. Their horses picked their way carefully down the treacherous slope, guided by Sarah's sure hand and Thomas's growing respect for her mountain skills. By the time they reached the valley, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The forest fire was visible as a red glow on the mountainside, but it seemed to be burning itself out against the rocky peaks rather than spreading into the valley. "We need to keep moving," Sarah said, though she could see the exhaustion in Thomas's face. "Garner will find a way around the fire, and he won't give up easily. Men like that never do." Thomas knew she was right, but he also knew that pushing too hard could be as dangerous as moving too slowly. Their horses were tired, and both humans were operating on adrenaline and determination rather than real strength. They needed rest, food, and a chance to plan their next move carefully. "There's a trading post about 15 miles south," he said. "Fellow named Murphy runs it. Good man, who doesn't ask too many questions. We can get fresh supplies there, and maybe word about what's happening in the territory." Sarah considered this suggestion. A trading post would offer supplies and information, but it would also mean contact with other people who might report their presence to the wrong authorities. On the other hand, they couldn't survive indefinitely in the wilderness without resupplying. "We go," she decided. "But we must be very careful. The Garner gang has friends and informants throughout this region. One wrong word to the wrong person, and we'll be back where we started." They rode through the night, following old Indian trails that Sarah knew from her childhood. These paths were invisible to most white eyes, but they offered safe passage for those who knew how to read the subtle signs carved into trees and arranged in patterns of stones. Thomas marveled at Sarah's ability to navigate in the darkness, finding direction from stars and landforms that meant nothing to him. Murphy's trading post appeared before them like a beacon of civilization as the eastern sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn. It was a rough log building with a corral and several outbuildings, strategically located at the intersection of two major trails. Smoke rose from its chimney, and lamplight glowed warmly in its windows, promising hot food and human company after their night of hard travel. But as they approached the building, Thomas's satisfaction turned to alarm. There were too many horses in the corral, and some of them looked familiar. His blood turned cold as he recognized the distinctive paint horse that Jake Garner preferred to ride. "Trap," Sarah breathed, reading the same signs that had alerted Thomas. "They got here ahead of us somehow." Thomas cursed their luck, but he had to admit that Garner had shown considerable cunning in anticipating their destination. The outlaw leader understood frontier survival as well as anyone, and he had correctly guessed that they would need to resupply at the nearest trading post. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, though she was already turning her horse away from the dangerous building. Thomas thought quickly, weighing their options. They could try to circle around the trading post and continue south. But their supplies were running low, and their horses needed rest. They could try to find another settlement, but that would mean days of additional travel through country that Garner now knew they were crossing. "We go in," he said finally, surprising Sarah with his boldness. "But not the way they expect. Murphy's a friend, and if I know him, he's not happy about having outlaws in his establishment. Maybe we can turn this situation to our advantage." Sarah stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "That's suicide. They'll shoot us down the moment we walk through the door." "Not if we're smart about it," Thomas said, the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. "Trust me, Sarah. Sometimes the best place to hide is right under your enemy's nose." As the sun rose over the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley floor, Thomas and Sarah prepared to walk directly into the lion's den. The final confrontation with the Garner gang was about to begin, and only cunning and courage would determine who would survive to see another sunset.